What if the man repairing an old leaky barn roof in the rain wasn't just a drifter with calloused hands, but a billionaire running from everything money couldn't fix? And what if the woman who gave him a warm meal and a dry porch to sleep under was the only person who'd ever truly seen him? Long before the world knew his name, would you dare to choose someone not for their fame, but for the way they look at you, like your home? If you believe in the power of kindness, unexpected love, and second chances, hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments, because today's story might just be one you'll never forget. Now let's begin. Maybe no one is ever truly ready to return to the place they once walked away from. Scarlett Monroe pulled her truck off the muddy gravel road that led into Oakmere Hollow Ranch, her heart heavier than the overcast sky above. A call from her father 3 days ago had unraveled 5 years of trying to build a new life. He hadn't said much, just, if you want to see her one last time, it has to be now. The old wooden gate groaned dryly, as if protesting her return. Weeds choked the once familiar path. The barn, once the canvas where her mother painted watercolor dreams, was now just a weathered frame, slumped and leaning into the wind. Scarlett stood on the porch, her fingers brushing the crack in the wood where her mother had marked her height each year. Her chest tightened. It had been a year since her mother passed. Yet inside the house, nothing had changed. Everything remained as if her mother had simply stepped out for a moment, maybe to fetch an apple pie from the oven, humming softly from the kitchen. She hadn't expected to feel anything, but what hit her wasn't tears. It was emptiness, the kind that knew, deep down, she hadn't been there when her mother took her last breath. Her father looked older, frailer, thinner, quieter. Over dinner, he didn't ask about the city, her job, or the man she once loved and left behind. He only said one thing. Your mother always said, that barn wasn't meant for anyone else to fix but you. It's waiting, Scar. That night, as Scarlett sat alone under the dripping porch roof, she looked out at the crumbling barn like an old friend left behind too long. And though she didn't know why, something inside her whispered, all right, let's start over. The rain started the moment Scarlett switched off the porch light, not the gentle, nostalgic kind, but a relentless downpour, like the sky itself was testing her resolve to return. She wasn't afraid of thunder anymore, but the sputtering engine that echoed through the night, now that made her heart skip. An old, mildew-streaked pickup slid across the gravel road leading up to the ranch. It rolled to a stop near Westbrook Barn, the one with the roof that had collapsed 2 winters ago. Scarlett stood behind the curtain, unsure whether to move or stay still, until he stepped out. A man she'd never seen before, tall, unshaven with a patchy beard, rain-soaked jacket clinging to his frame, boots sinking into the mud. He didn't try to impress. He didn't apologize for showing up unannounced. He was just strangely calm. Sorry to bother you, he said, voice low but clear through the rain. Heard the place needed a roof fixed. I'm not asking for money, just a hot meal and somewhere dry to sleep tonight. Scarlett stepped onto the porch, her hair damp from the mist, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. She glanced at his hands, reddened from the cold, calloused from hard work. Real, rough. There was nothing threatening about him, and yet something kept her cautious. You a carpenter? She asked. Number mechanic. He shrugged slightly. But I know how to keep things from falling apart completely. A strong gust slammed the barn door shut with a bone-deep thud. Scarlett looked toward Westbrook Barn, then back at the man still standing silently in the rain. Neither of them said another word. She simply opened the porch door and said softly, Come in. I've got chicken soup in a storage room that's not too cold, for now. And she didn't know it then, but that quiet nod he gave her, that's where everything began. Scarlett didn't know exactly what made her open the porch door that night. Instinct, compassion, or something deeper she couldn't name. Ethan Wells was set up in the old storage room behind the stables. It had once held winter hay, but now it offered only a rusty folding cot, an aging space heater, and the scent of damp wood laced with time. She handed him a bowl of chicken soup and a dry towel. He nodded in quiet thanks, then ate in silence, like words cost more than he could afford. But just as Scarlett turned to leave, he spoke. A single sentence, yet enough to stop her in her tracks. This place feels like it meant something to someone. She turned back. It was my mom, she said. This barn was her world. Ethan looked out the small window, rain still tapping against the glass. His eyes, storm gray, tired, held no performance, no evasion. Just regret. She wasn't used to that feeling, the sense of being understood without needing to explain. The next morning, she was up earlier than usual. The coffee hadn't even started to brew when the sound of hammering echoed across the yard. Ethan was already on a ladder, carefully removing rotten planks from the barn's roof. No questions, no asking permission, just working, as if he'd belonged there all along. Scarlett brought him coffee. He took it, sipped once, and murmured as if speaking to no one in particular. Good coffee. And this wood, it's not all gone yet. She laughed, for the first time in months. Not a loud laugh, but the kind that makes your heart exhale just a little. As she turned to go back inside, he added, I know how to hold broken things together. Not to make them what they used to be, but to give them a chance to become something new. Scarlett paused. That wasn't just about the barn, and she found herself wondering, was this man fixing a roof or trying to mend something quietly falling apart inside himself? Each morning when Scarlett stepped into the yard with her first cup of coffee, Ethan was already there, sleeves rolled up, shirt damp with morning dew, carefully measuring each beam, tracing every worn crack with quiet precision. He didn't speak much, but every strike of his hammer felt deliberate, as if he wasn't just rebuilding an old barn, but silently counting the heartbeats he'd lost along the way. One morning they replaced a broken rafter together. Scarlett clumsily held the board while Ethan worked from the ladder above, tapping nails in rhythm. When his hammer slipped and nearly fell, she burst out laughing. For the first time since her mother's funeral, she didn't feel guilty for smiling. I used to draw up here, Scarlett said suddenly while cleaning the loft, before I believed that making money was what it meant to really live. Ethan didn't answer. He simply handed her a charcoal pencil he'd found under the floorboards. Some things don't disappear, he said quietly. They just wait for us to come back. The next day she left her first new sketch, a sunset over the barn on the dining table. He looked at it longer than she expected, then finally said, You captured the emotion of the wood. It was such a strange thing to say that she laughed, but her heart caught in her chest. He didn't see what was on the surface. He saw what lived beneath, the part of her she'd long forgotten. In the stillness of the afternoons, they shared stories about her quiet father, about Ethan's younger sister, who died at 30, leaving him behind in a world that suddenly felt too loud, too empty. And then there was a pause, quiet, tentative, when Scarlett asked, Did you come here to fix a barn or to run from something? Ethan was silent for a long time, then softly replied, I think I came here to be seen, just once, by someone who didn't need me to explain who I am. And Scarlett understood. This wasn't about wood or nails or the bones of a barn anymore. This was about two people trying to rebuild themselves from the broken pieces no one else could see. Scarlett hadn't planned on digging deeper, but everything changed when an article unexpectedly popped up on the old computer in her father's study. Ethan Wells, the mind behind Argus Tech, the multi-billion-dollar diagnostics empire. The headline blazed across the screen. The photo showed a man forcing a polite smile at a podium, standing beside a young woman, her eyes unmistakably like Ethan's. Scarlett froze. She recognized the face. Grace Harper, his sister. She had appeared briefly in the media years ago, before vanishing from it entirely. The news hadn't said much, just that she had passed away suddenly at 30. But the eyes in that photo told a different story. A story of loneliness hidden behind a smile, and an older brother who had always stood behind her, never quite in time to hold on. That evening, as Ethan patched up the west wall of the barn, Scarlett approached and handed him the article. No accusations, just silence and waiting. He looked at the photo for a moment, then gave a small nod, like a piece of himself had just been uncovered, and he no longer had the strength to hide it. "I'm not running from the world," Ethan said quietly. "I just didn't know how to keep living in it once Grace was gone." He told her about the days after the funeral, the emptiness of his office, the way he faked strength for the boardroom, while inside he was barely holding on. "I couldn't fix the company, Scarlett, but I could fix a barn. And maybe through that, I could learn how to hold myself together again." Scarlett didn't say a word. She just reached out and touched his arm, gently. Not because of who he was, but because she saw it clearly now. In his eyes, a man who was hurting, but no longer hiding. And for the first time, she didn't see someone repairing a roof. She saw a man quietly piecing his heart back together. After Grace passed, Ethan never returned to headquarters. He didn't take down his nameplate. He didn't sell his shares right away. He just left. No one understood why a man who once stood center stage at a tech summit in Tokyo, shaking hands with global investors, would walk away with nothing but a backpack, a toolbox, and a map with no names. Scarlett never asked how many places he'd been, but once while they were repainting the barn door together, she caught a glimpse of a torn piece of map tucked into his shirt pocket, marked with red pencil over towns so small they barely existed on Google Maps. "I'm not running," Ethan had said once, his eyes focused on a rusted hinge he was removing. "I'm just patching up the things other people gave up on." He'd repaired a windmill that had stood abandoned for 18 years in Idaho, rebuilt the roof of an old shop destroyed by a storm in Arizona. No payment, no name left behind. Just arrivals, quiet stays, and even quieter departures, as if what he left behind wasn't a fixed structure, but the quiet reminder that something was still worth keeping. Scarlett watched him work, the way he measured not for perfection, but for strength. The way he drove each screw not for show, but to make sure something finally held together and didn't fall apart again. "Are you trying to fix the whole world?" she'd once teased. Ethan had just smiled, shaking his head. "I'm not fixing the world. I'm just finding small corners where I can leave a little light." And Scarlett understood. This man wasn't the failure the world once assumed he was. He had simply chosen a different kind of success, to become the kind of person someone, somewhere, could lean on, even if just for one rainy season. That afternoon, the rain tapped gently on the old tin roof of Westbrook Barn. Scarlett was cleaning out the attic, the room that once served as her mother's art studio, when she found it, a weathered cedar box tucked behind a rotting beam. Dust covered every inch. The hinges had dulled with time, but the wood still held its soft scent, as if the years had failed to erase what was inside. She opened the lid. Inside were faded brown ink sketches, a few old photographs, and a soft leather journal tied with a silver ribbon. Her mother's voice returned in each handwritten line. No drama, no self-pity, just the voice of a woman who had once loved deeply. "I fell in love with a man who had nothing but calloused hands and a heart that never stopped trying to fix what was broken. He wasn't accepted, he wasn't trusted, and me, I let him go, because I wasn't strong enough to choose him over my family." Scarlett read slowly, each word sinking deep. "I told myself there would be another chance, but he was the chance, the only one." A single tear slipped down her cheek. She looked around the attic, the air still faintly holding the memory of watercolor paints, the scratch of pencil on paper, and her mother's soft laughter. And now it was also the place where truth quietly surfaced. Truth her mother had never spoken aloud. Ethan was patching up the porch roof when she stepped outside. Sunlight cutting through raindrops, glinting like silver threads across the wet wood. "You used to think you were the only wanderer," Scarlett said gently, "but I just found out. My mother once loved someone just like you, and she didn't have the courage to hold on." Ethan froze, looked at her, said nothing. But in that moment, amidst rain, sunlight, and secrets long buried, something became clear. Scarlett wasn't going to repeat her mother's story. She wasn't going to let love slip away again, just because she was afraid of being wrong. Ethan disappeared on a morning wrapped in mist. No note, no sound of an engine. Just the tool shed where he once slept, left untouched. The cot folded neatly. The shirt he always wore hung on the hook by the door, and his empty coffee mug placed precisely on the edge of the kitchen counter. Scarlett stood in silence at the doorway of that little room. She didn't cry. She wasn't angry. But something opened inside her, a stillness, colder than the autumn breeze drifting through the old wooden frame. The next day, as she prepared to patch up the south wall with whatever scrap wood she could find, a truck rolled to a stop at the edge of Woodmere Drive. No one stepped out. Only a cedar wood pallet, sealed and labeled. Custom dimensions per Westbrook barn specs. The day after, it was a set of low-voltage lights designed for community restoration spaces. Then came a new saw, a pre-assembled shelving unit. Each delivery arrived quietly, intentionally, all meant for this place. Scarlett didn't need to ask who sent them. She already knew. He might have left, but he had never let go of what they were building together. And so every morning, with dew still clinging to the porch rails, she rolled up her sleeves and picked up the hammer. Not to wait for Ethan to return, but because he never really left. She learned to cut straighter, to drive nails more firmly. Each step on the newly laid floor whispered back to her, "I'm still moving forward, not alone." Ethan left no signature, no name, but he left trust. And to Scarlett, that meant more than any promise. Because some people, even when they're no longer there to hold your hand, still find ways to keep you standing, from afar. Scarlett never set out to draw attention. She just wanted to finish the barn, carry on her mother's dream, and hold on to something that still felt like it truly belonged to her family. But everything began to shift when a headline appeared on the front page of the Prairie Voice Gazette. "Every nail counts, a daughter's promise, and the barn that refused to die." No clickbait, no glamorous shots, just a few raw photos. Scarlett with paint on her hands, determination in her eyes, and a barn that was still unfinished, but full of life. And somehow that story found its way into people's hearts. That weekend, an elderly couple from the next town over showed up with a box of nails and 2 loaves of bread. "We got married in a barn just like this," they said with a smile. "If you don't mind, we'd love to lend a hand." Then a retired teacher offered to host reading circles inside the old hayloft. A group of local students came to pick up trash and rebuild the back fence. A mechanic donated a used generator. "Nah, still runs fine," he said. "Just needs someone to care for it." Scarlett no longer had to hammer every nail alone. Through the crisp autumn air, the sound of hammers rang, not out of necessity, but belief. Belief that this place was worth saving. Fresh beams were raised, makeshift classrooms were marked off, and someone hung a hand-painted sign at the gate, "Westbrook Barn, where starting over begins with 2 hands and 1 heart." Scarlett stood beneath the porch, watching the space that once stood hollow now buzz with life. And she whispered, "Do you see this, Ethan? Everything you touched, even in silence, has the power to bring a whole community back to life. And that's how things that seem small, when nurtured by trust, can quietly become miracles that breathe hope into an entire town." The news broke on a blustery morning. A major finance blog had suddenly resurfaced an old photo. Ethan Wells, co-founder of a tech company once valued near $1 billion. In the image, his face was composed, hair neatly combed, wearing a tie, standing in front of the Titan Diagnostics logo. Beneath it, the headline read, "Missing Billionaire Allegedly Found. Rebuilding a Barn in Kansas." Scarlett stood on the porch, the newspaper trembling slightly in her hands as the wind passed through. She wasn't shocked. A part of her had always known Ethan carried something heavier than the toolbox he hauled around each day. But knowing it was one thing, watching the world strip away the quiet he'd found was another. The press began to circle in. Questions, flashing lights, interview requests. One brunette woman in a cream blazer even showed up at Westbrook Barn, holding out a microphone. "Did you know who he really was?" Scarlett looked at her, then at the camera. "I know he's the man who helped me rebuild everything, when no one else even bothered to care." Then she turned away, quietly closing the wooden gate behind her. She didn't tell Ethan. She didn't text him. She didn't bring it up when they met later that evening. Both crouched over the final section of the porch they were repairing. She simply stayed silent, so he could just be himself. Not a headline, not a missing billionaire, but the man with calloused hands and a heart healing slowly, in his own time. Scarlett understood that sometimes the deepest way to love someone isn't to shield them with words, but to hold enough space in your silence so they can still be exactly who they are, even when the whole world is making noise outside. Scarlett didn't think she'd ever see Ethan again. Ever since his identity was exposed, he vanished without a trace. No text, no sign of him, not even a goodbye. And then, on a late afternoon near sunset, with the wind bending the tall grass on Lakeview Bluff, there he was, standing in the golden haze of the fading light and the last hum of summer cicadas, holding something small in his hand. A key, tied to a raw leather cord, looped through a copper ring etched with the initials, S and E. "I didn't build it to convince you of anything," he said quietly. "I built it so that if one day you're ready, you'd know there's a place to start again, not defined by the past, or money, or fear." Scarlett blinked, her breath catching. She followed where his hand pointed, and there, nestled against the slope of the hill, surrounded by pale purple wildflowers, stood a small cedar cabin, windows facing east, a wide porch, just big enough for two people and a dog, and inside, a waiting easel. The light pouring through the glass looked just like those mornings they used to share in silence, coffee warm between their hands. Scarlett tightened her grip around the key. She didn't say a word. She just stepped forward and rested her head against his chest, the place where she never had to pretend to be strong. And through the wind she whispered, "If this is where we begin again, I don't want to begin without you." That cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was an answer to a love that had broken once, but never truly disappeared. On the day they married, the sky was inexplicably clear. After days of rain had washed the world quiet, there was no expensive gown, no lavish reception, just soft morning sunlight streaming through newly painted wooden beams and simple string lights swaying in the breeze like quiet laughter. Westbrook Barn, once collapsed, now stood proudly with a new name, the Wells Center for Restoration. Inside, the old stalls had become woodworking classrooms, rehab spaces for veterans, and creative corners for those who had once lost sight of their dreams. Etched above the loft door was a single hand-carved phrase, "Where the things thought lost are rebuilt by heart." Scarlett walked through the wide barn doors, holding a bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered herself from the hillside near the cabin, their quiet promise tucked into the earth. Her dress was simple, ivory cotton, her boots worn, but her eyes burned bright, like the June sun itself. Ethan stood waiting at the end of the aisle, not in a tailored suit, but in a linen shirt, paint still clinging faintly to his hands. And he had never looked more like himself. They didn't read pre-written vows. They simply held each other's hands and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for staying long enough to see this was still worth beginning again." When they kissed, the crowd clapped, not for appearances, but for a love built from weathered beams, rusted nails, and the cracks that once made others walk away. They hadn't fixed the past. They chose to keep living and to make it the foundation of something no one could ever take apart. No one ever imagined that a barn once left in ruins, a hollow shell echoing with forgotten memories, would one day become the place where people began to believe again. Westbrook Barn isn't just a community center now, though it bears the name the Wells Center for Restoration. It's a place people come to remember who they are. On Saturday mornings, the woodworking class rings with steady rhythms of hammer and saw. Boys who once sat in silence for hours, numbed by trauma, are now crafting their very first picture frames. In the western corner, a group of middle-aged women, former caretakers, wives, mothers, now learn to saw, sand, and build their own tables and chairs with their own hands. Each summer, the backfield transforms into a kids' camp. Children laugh under the warm afternoon sun, racing around fences rebuilt from the very boards that once lay broken. They paint signs with bright colors that read, "Everything can begin again." A war veteran teaches drawing. He once believed he had nothing left to give. Now he passes on the quiet peace he's found in every careful pencil stroke. A divorced woman from another state arrived with 2 children and a heart full of fractures. She stayed and now teaches bread making. And Scarlett, who once feared opening her heart, is now the one leading Tuesday night story time for the entire village. Ethan? He still works in the background, sometimes appearing just to fix a door hinge or inspect the porch roof. But everyone knows he is the heartbeat of this place. Westbrook Barn is no longer a barn. It's where broken lives learn to stand again and to rebuild, with both hands and all their heart. At Lakeview Bluff, nestled quietly along the hillside, the mornings always began with the gentle rustle of wind and sunlight spilling through old wooden window frames. In a space still rich with the scent of cedar, Scarlett poured 2 mugs of coffee, her hands still dusted with sawdust from the night before. Ethan emerged from the small workshop out back, his shirt wrinkled from a long night spent fixing the community classroom's bookshelf. They didn't say much, but between them, everything was already understood. No grand promises, no proposals printed in the papers, just 2 people who had once fallen apart, now choosing every day to stay. The cabin Ethan had built, once just a messy sketch inside his mind, had become their home, rooted in simple rituals, breakfast on the porch, shopping lists for nails and paint, quiet evenings reading Scarlett's mother's old letters, silent but deeply connected. Sometimes during the rainy season, they sat together and listened to the drops tap against the tin roof. They didn't talk about what was lost. They only spoke of what they were building together. Ethan, the man who once believed he was nothing more than shattered pieces that couldn't be put back, now gently dried Scarlett's hair with a worn-out towel, so tenderly it was as if he'd never been broken at all. Scarlett, who once feared love, had learned how to trust again, not because of who Ethan was, but because he stayed, even when she wasn't sure she deserved it. And the cabin where they lived wasn't a place to hide. It was a place where they dared to dream, dared to begin again, and dared to love, without needing to explain a single thing. Because real love doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be lived. Every single day. One late autumn afternoon, as the last red leaves clung to the edge of the porch roof, Scarlett found a journal her mother had carefully hidden behind an old wooden panel in the cabin's kitchen cupboard. The pages were yellowed, the ink blurred in places by tears, but the words still rose clear, as if written for this very moment. If you find someone who sees your cracks and still chooses to stay, that's not just love. That's the beginning of home. Scarlett went still. She had once believed love had to be perfect, certain, untouched by the past. But then Ethan appeared, flawed, quiet, sometimes unreadable. Yet he was the first person who ever made her feel unashamed of everything she'd once tried to hide. He never asked about the scars on her hands. He simply held them when they trembled. He never tried to fix her. He just quietly repaired the leaking barn roof at night so she could fall asleep without hearing the rain seeping through the walls. And now, as she read the final line of her mother's journal, Scarlett understood. Love isn't about saving someone. It's the choice to stay, even when leaving would be easier. That evening, Scarlett brought the journal out to the porch and set it beside Ethan. She didn't speak. She simply placed her hand on his. And for the first time, he didn't look away. Their eyes met, steady, unguarded, as if both of them finally understood. There was nothing left to hide, because a true home isn't made of 4 walls. It's made of one person brave enough to see all your broken pieces and still choose to stay. And then, in a place once covered in dust and the cracks of unhealed memories. On a quiet morning at Lakeview Bluff, Scarlett stood on the porch of the little cabin, watching as children giggled, proudly holding the wooden crafts they had just made at summer camp. Locals lined up outside for the next workshop. Hands that once only knew how to hide pain were now building something together, a place where no one felt alone anymore. Ethan stepped out, a steaming cup of tea in his hand. They didn't need to say much anymore. Everything was clear now, not because of what had been lost, but because of what they chose to rebuild, together. And in the soft chime of the wind bells, a little girl shyly tugged Scarlett's hand and whispered, "Did you really make all of this?" All by yourself? Scarlett knelt down, smiled, her eyes holding that gentle light only those who've walked through darkness carry. Not by myself, she said, but with all my heart. A second chance doesn't come to the perfect. It finds those brave enough to believe again, to forgive, and to start over, even when it feels like it might be too late. And you know what? It all began with a single rainy night, a man asking to fix a barn in exchange for a place to sleep, and a woman who found the courage to open her heart one more time. If you believe love has the power to rebuild a life, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the stories that warm your soul. Because sometimes, the biggest things begin with the smallest act of kindness. Perhaps the most beautiful part of Scarlett and Ethan's story wasn't the barn that was rebuilt or the cedar cabin that now overlooked the lake at sunrise. It was the moment a broken person dared to lift their head and keep walking, and another chose to reach for that hand. Not because of the past, not for fame, but simply because they saw each other for who they truly were. We all carry cracks. Sometimes they come from family wounds, from silent grief, or simply from feeling like we don't belong anywhere. But this story reminds us, it's often in the places that seem most broken that the foundation for something beautiful begins. Ethan once believed he didn't deserve a normal life. Scarlett once thought her mother's past had already written her future. But two people who chose to love, to trust, and to stay rewrote the ending they were once convinced they had no control over. And if today you're standing in the middle of a Westbrook barn within yourself, cracked, abandoned, waiting, remember this: it's never too late to begin again. A house can be rebuilt with wood, but a home? It begins with a heart that still believes love is worth it. Be kind. Give, even before you feel ready, because who knows, you might be someone's second chance.